Hi, everyone. My name is Yannick Dils. I've been working in IT for over 12 to 13 years now. Last 5 to 6 years, been working on some larger and smaller cloud migration projects. And in this session, we want to talk to you about our lessons learned and how implementing a decent governance framework helped us out along the way.
Hey everyone, my name is Thomas van Laere and I'm an independent Microsoft Azure consultant. I help organizations with lowering their operational costs through the Azure platform and through the use of open source technologies. I've had the pleasure of working with Yannick for several years now, and we've come across lots of interesting challenges, and that includes working out governance strategies for all sorts of different Azure environments. That being said, we hope to inform you on some of the various sorts of Azure governance tools that you have at your disposal, most of which are actually built into the platform itself. Now, at the start of my Azure journey, I used to take advantage of the fact that I could easily deploy resources to meet some specific goal. This way I could deliver value relatively quickly. The only downside to this was that all the brakes were off. I could just deploy anything that I wanted to without any restrictions. This is fun for a bit, but it's not a very durable long-term solution. Anyway, after some time, I needed to ensure that I could meet compliancy targets. This was especially the case in large corporate environments. So the question then becomes, how do we set up the rules of the game that we need to abide by to meet those specific standards? This is where a lot of those governance tools come into play. If you've been following this space these last few years, you might have noticed that a lot has been improved on this front. The tools are actually growing in terms of what they're capable of. And let's just demonstrate that by jumping into the first governance tip.
Thank you, Thomas, for the introduction. Now let's have a look at our first tip of the day. That's implementing management groups. Now, customers often ask, what is cloud governance? Well, we tend to explain that cloud governance is a set of tools built into the Azure platform that can help you maintain and keep your environment at a current state or a certain state. It keeps your environment healthy and allows a certain level of control on top of your environment. And management groups is one of the first things that you should consider when implementing a new governance framework on Azure. Now, there are a couple of tips around management groups as well. So first, when should you use a management group? A management group can be useful, or multiple management groups can be useful to manage multiple subscriptions. In many corporate and enterprise environments, we see approximately 20 to 30 subscriptions. Now, managing those all one by one isn't that easy. So management groups helps us to keep a certain level of control on top of all of our subscriptions. Now, prior to starting with management groups, you should always initiate your root tenant group prior to deploying. Each and every Azure tenant has a root tenant group. It isn't initiated by default, so that's one of the first steps that you should perform when you start with management groups. Also, think about a naming strategy. Your management group name should be unique within your tenant. You can't have management groups with the same name, as the Microsoft platform will mix things up in the background. Also, think about subscription placement. Have a chat with your development teams, your operations teams, and define which subscriptions should be placed into a certain management group. On top of our management groups, we can start applying governance policies with Azure Policy, and also apply role-based access controls on top of our management groups, which then allow multiple controls on top of our Azure subscriptions. So let's have a look at a small demo. So let's have a look at a demo about management groups. A couple of key takeaways that we need to do first are initiate our management groups. Think about naming conventions and assigning some role assignments, so we don't get stuck later on in the process if we accidentally remove a management group and lose all of our permissions on top of our subscriptions. So let's have a look. I've added a couple of variables. This is my tenant ID where I will be performing all of my tasks, my signing name. And the first thing that we need to do, of course, is sign in to our Azure account. Let's open that into a container. There we go. So we've successfully logged on. And as you can see, this is my environment. It's totally empty and cleared out for the demos. Let's start by adding a couple of services on my left side dock. Let's add our management groups and continue with our subscriptions. So for demo purposes, I have 2 subscriptions available that we then can start sorting into management groups. If we have a look at the management group, currently we don't have any management group available except for the default tenant root group, which is available by default for each and every Azure tenant and Azure subscriptions that you have. Now let's start organizing these a little bit more. So I've created a couple of scripts that can help us out in organizing our management groups. So first off, let's set a context to one of our specific subscriptions. So one of these 2, let me select the Microsoft Partner Network subscription. To have a look at our role assignments, we can see I've already performed a couple of demos like this, and that my user already has a couple of role assignments available. So key requirements before you start with Azure management groups is to assign the following role assignments to your user account. So these are 3 commands that you can use. And you can see the scope is a / and the / means that you will be adding it to the root of your Azure AD tenant. Since I've already have the role assignment available to my account, I will not be adding them here anymore. Let's retrieve all of my user details. So as you can see, this will be the details I'm getting from my user. Just to verify the same thing as we saw in the Azure portal is that we only have the tenant root group. Now the root management group ID is always populated in this format. So it ends with the tenant ID that you are working on, and then we need to assign some stuff with the user object ID. So let's store those in the variables as well. As our session title states, our theme of today is the Jurassic Park and Jurassic World themes. So we've added some naming conventions in that area as well. So we will be creating a parent group, which will be located directly beneath the root tenant group, then a site A and a site B, a production environment, development environment, and then our carnivores and herbivores management groups. So these are just naming conventions that we will be using on later on in the demo. So let's store them as well. Now, before you get started with management groups, if you do all of this via the portal, it might take some time before you see your initial management group, so your root management group. This means because Microsoft is trying to fill a lot of details in the background to initiate your management group. Now, if you want to automate this, you can automate this by invoking a couple of REST APIs towards the management group API. So let's first set everything into our context, create a header with our access token and stuff like that as well. And then we can invoke our header, and this will start the tenant backfill. So this will initiate the process which will be happening in the background. And then the next one, we can check for the status request. And unfortunately, something is going wrong. So let's have a look at that. So it did complete, so it should be completed. Not sure why. Probably a change in the naming. So, but anyway, we already did this in upfront, so we already initiated our management group, so we can just continue and get started with the next section. Now there's a couple of options for deploying management group. You've got the Azure portal, of course, where you can create a new management groups and add subscriptions, but there's a couple of PowerShell commands available, and there's an ARM template available, which can help you in deploying management groups to your subscriptions. Just be very careful that you will be targeting the subscription and not the resource group to deploy on. Now for our demo, let's have a look at the PowerShell commandlets. It's fairly simply and very simple. Just new AZ management group name, display name, and then you need to you do a get to store it in a variable, and then we can use that later on to build some kind of hierarchy to store our management groups nicely beneath each other. So let's run this section first. Now, if we have a look on the Azure Management Portal, it usually takes a while before it refreshes on the Azure portal. Usually for deployments that take a while, you could use a as job parameter, but unfortunately, since we are building upon the previously built management groups, we need the management group to be completed before we can continue with the following section. So let's review if it's already available, and here we go. We have our engine management group right beneath the tenant root group. Now let's continue with the following deployments. Let's create a site A and a site B resource group, management group. Okay, there we go, and then we can start filling all of the others. So let's grab some more as well. I can just continue deploy in the background. So if we refresh our page and we unfold the engine management group, we can see that site A has been created. Now, if you click on the management groups itself, you can see here the management groups that are right below this one in the hierarchy, and all of the subscriptions resource groups that are directly connected to this. Later on in the session, we will be talking about policies as well, and RBAC that we will be deploying on top of management groups. So everything that you deploy upon a certain management group is inherited to all of the management groups directly below, or the subscriptions that are attached to the management groups. So it takes a while for all of the groups to complete. Now, as soon as we have our management group hierarchy in place, we can start moving our subscriptions to a specific management group, so that we can apply policies and settings, some RBAC on top of those management groups to inherit on those subscriptions. In a couple of seconds, we will be seeing site B has been created, and just below site A, we've got our production environment management group. Here we have our development environment management group. In this way, we can build a really nice hierarchy to store all of our subscriptions. Now, in this case, for demo purposes, we only have 2. But imagine in corporate and enterprise environments, you would have 20 or 30 subscriptions for each and every business unit for a separate application that you can then easily manage within this management group hierarchy. Okay, so the last couple of management groups to complete our hierarchy. So this is the root blade of the management groups. Here you can see your entire hierarchy, but if you drill down into a single management group, you can get more details into that specific management group, of course. Here in the path, you can also see how your management group hierarchy is built. And you can drill down by just clicking to the upper management group if you like or prefer. Okay, ready or almost ready. In the next section, now it's time to move our subscriptions, of course. So what we will do is we will store the subscription that we want to move into a variable and then add the subscription into one of our tenants, of course. Now, in this case, we do add a new easy management group subscription. Our group name is just our tenant ID, and then the subscription is the one from above. And the management groups, we just assign one and then we can upload it afterwards. Okay, so let's have a look on our completion state. It's not there yet. Here are our dev carnivores management groups. Now, if you click on one of the subscriptions, for example, here you can see all the details from that subscription. And if you click here, move, and then we can start moving it to a management group you like. For our demo, we will be moving it into the carnivores, for example. And this is a very important one. Moving a management group or subscription to be under a different management group could change all of the access. So if you have some granular deny access or lower level access defined, just make sure that you don't lose control on top of all of your management groups. And that's why we initiated our hierarchy administrator role assignment, because if you assign that role, you will always be able to get your subscriptions back, even if you lose access to it by forcing some granular level controls in it. So yeah, almost there. So what we will do is we will move our MPN to our production carnivores group and our MCT to the development carnivores group. There we go. And then we should see that there is no subscription available anymore directly under the tenant root group, and our subscriptions are now being managed right at the top down management group. So that concludes our demo about management groups. If you want to clean up all of your management groups, just loop through all of the management groups you have and just remove them. So this is actually the only way to reinitiate your entire management group hierarchy. So on to the next section.
Here's another great tip. Don't be afraid of using RBAC. It stands for role-based access control and is a great way to ensure that you can really lock down a set of specific actions that a security principal is able to perform on the platform. A security principal is an object that represents a user, a group, a service principal, or a managed identity that is requesting access to Azure resources. Let's take a look at what I mean by jumping into a demo. So I'm going to go into my subscriptions, and I really want to apply some role-based access control settings to our West Europe development subscription. So the scenario here is that I want to add the contributor role to the operations group, and I want to add the reader role to the support level 1 group. So that means that our operations team will be able to restart virtual machines, maybe change around some storage account settings, but they won't be able to add role assignments to other users because they're in the contributor role. If they want to do that, they have to use the user access role in order to do that. And for our support group, I really just want them to be able to look at our Azure resources, but not modify them. So that's why we're assigning them the reader role. So if you go into access control here, you can take a look at all the current role assignments that have been assigned to this subscription. You can see we have about 9 of them. So we'll just add a new role assignment, add the contributor role. You can always check on the default roles what they will do. They always have this little information icon. So I'll just click contributor, and then I'll search for the operations group. There we go. And that's that. I'll just hit save. And I will also add the reader role to the support level 1 group. Okay, there we go. So that's being added. Okay. Let's see if I hit refresh. Says it's the results filtered, so I'll just swap back and forth. There we go. So now the operations group has the contributor role and the support level 1 group has the reader role. Excellent. Now what this is going to do, since we assigned it to the subscription, this is going to trickle down to every resource group and every Azure resource that's in those resource groups. We can see this in action if we just select one of these resource groups. So I'll go into the storage resource group for now, click access control, go to role assignments, and you'll see that the operations group has the contributor role and that it has been inherited from the subscription. And the same thing applies to the support level 1. And if we take a look at the storage account, any of them really, we'll see the exact same thing. So we go into access control, roles, role assignments rather, and you'll see the same thing. So there we go. That seems to be working correctly. And if I now go to one of the users that is in the support level 1 group, so that's Kim, I believe, is the only person in this support level 1 group. If I hit refresh, Now, if I were to go back into my other account, so in my admin account, I can even modify those settings. I can override what has been assigned on the subscription level and do something completely different on the resource itself. So again, this system is pretty flexible. Let's see this in action. I can give Kim the contributor role here on the storage account. So on the logs 2 storage account. So if I search for Kim, I can do it like that, or I can select the group, but I'll just select the user just to highlight the difference. There we go, Kim's been added. So if I switch back, then hopefully if I refresh, I would like to leave the page. If I refresh, then I should be able to change things. Okay, so there we go. So if I hit save now, see that it can update the storage account. Excellent. If I look at the role assignments from Kim's perspective, you'll see that she is actually a contributor only on this storage account. So if we go and take a look at the other storage account, or even on this resource group, you'll see that Kim is not a contributor. Let's take a look at the other resource group just to verify. Yep, and there we go. That's how flexible access control is. So awesome.
Let's first go to the Azure portal and add policy here on the left side pane. If you click on policy, you get the overview, the getting started guide, some compliance checks as well. Now, when you go to authoring, your first starting point would be to go to definitions. And within those definitions, there's already a pre-built set of Azure policies provided by Microsoft that you can use to deploy on top of your environment. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of built-in, and those are categorized based on their specific category. So if you would look Okay, great. Now we have our management zones, we have our role-based access controls, we have our Azure policies. Now it's time to get started with our fourth tip of the day, and that's building appropriate landing zones. It's one of the pillars when building a cloud adoption framework for sure. And it's like when building a house, you often hire an architect, which then designs your architectural pillars. And based on some official guidelines, he will define how tall, big, and deep your house can be. He then describes how the flooring plan needs to be implemented, the air conditioning, and so on. And as you all know, a solid foundation is the cornerstone of keeping your house up and running for the next couple of years, tens of years. Well, the exact same methodology should be applied to your cloud environment. Now, there is a thing that can help us out, which is called Azure Blueprints. Now, Azure Blueprints has been in private preview, public preview for the last couple of years. It looks as like Microsoft isn't investing a lot anymore in Azure Blueprint, but as you can see, it's made up of three main pillars, which are RM templates, which define your resources and your environments, policy definitions, Azure policies that we've already talked about, and role-based access controls that we can apply on top of our management groups, our subscriptions, and our resource groups. So all of these combined can be put into an Azure Blueprint, which is then your blueprint for your environment. So we've already seen Azure policy definitions. We've already seen role-based access controls. Let's have a look at some pre-built ARM templates that can help you define all of your landing zones. When we go to the Azure portal and add the blueprints service on the left side pane, you can see it's still in preview, and it has been in preview for a couple of years now. Now, how does blueprints work? You've got your blueprint definitions and you've got assignments, sort of the same as with Azure policy. You first create a definition, and then you perform an assignment, and during the assignment, you can provide parameters that can populate your definition. So when we go to definitions, we can create a new blueprint, and you've got a lot of examples that you can start off with. But for our demo purposes, let's start with a new one. Let's give this blueprint a name, Dr. Blueprint. And a definition location, same as with Azure policy. It's advised to set the definition on your top level hierarchy, and in this case, it's our engine management group. And to deploy our landing zones. Then the next step is our artifacts. So a blueprint can be deployed on a subscription. However, it can also be deployed onto a management group. Now, depending on the amount of subscriptions you have within that management group, it is advised to first look if a subscription deployment fits your needs, or that by trimming down a blueprint with only certain actions, and you could assign it to a management group. For example, role-based access controls or policies can be easily applied to a management group. Deployments of resources are mostly done within a subscription. So for our demo, let's have a look at how we can deploy it to a subscription. The first thing that we need to do is add an artifact. And an artifact can be of the type of a policy assignment, so an Azure policy, a role assignment, an RM template, or a resource group. Now, in this case, we have an empty environment with only management groups, subscriptions, and Azure policies, some RBAC assigned as well. So let's deploy some resource groups, and we deploy our resource groups with an RM template. So you give this artifact a name, resource groups, for example, and we already have our templates available. So all of the investments that you've done in the past by creating RM templates aren't lost, and you can easily reuse them. So I have my RM template folder here. So let's go to the resource group directory, our hub, for example. And it will just read all of the settings that you have defined within your RM templates. You can also, it will also automatically read all the parameters that are within your RM template. So let's click on add. Okay, great. So there's 4 parameters, and you have the option within the parameters that it should be applied when assigning the blueprint, or you can pre-populate it if you like as well. Now, in this case, we will do this when we assign our now customer variable, for example. That's something that we already can assign. So let's click save. Now the following. After we've deployed our resource groups, we can then start deploying resources within our resource group. Now, to deploy a resource within a resource group, we first need to add a resource group type artifact. Now, this will be our networking resource group. And our resource group name. In this case will be, let's just provide that on assignment as well. So, okay, perfect. And then we can deploy a new RM template, for example, that deploys our hub. So we can select a file, go to networking hub, deploy, and it will read our parameters as well. So here we go. Click on add, and let's save this one for our demo. So this is our demo blueprint. We can edit it as much as we like, but we can also publish it. It works with some kind of versioning, so you can add 0.1, for example, or V1, or whatever you like. So let's go for initial creation of our blueprint. Let's click on publish. There we go. Now, after we have a blueprint which is available to publish, we can assign it. So let's assign this blueprint to one of our subscriptions, and let's go for our MPN, which should be the West Europe subscription. Set our location, West Europe. There we go. This is our blueprint version. So if we have another version or a second version, we can assign a different version as well. We will not be locking the assignment, so we can change resources or delete resources as we like. If we do not delete or read only, there will be some resource locks applied on this as well. We will just be using a system assigned. And then we have our parameters that we can populate. So in this case, our site is site A. The resource group location will be West Europe. Location will be WEU. Our resource group name will be hub WU network RG. And our location is also West Europe. Like that. Our hub VNet Here we go. Our resource groups have been successfully deployed. Our virtual network has been created and our network security groups as well. So if we go and add our resource groups, for example, in our left side pane, we will nicely see our resource groups, and within our networking resource group, here is our identity in our hub, WVNet. So this is how Blueprint's assignment works. On to our next topic. So we have our Azure environment ready to start deploying some resources. Unless it was for our fifth tip of the day, to get your label maker. Often forgotten, but also powerful, is to apply tags to your resource groups and resources. Now, what is a tag? A tag can define what a resource is, can define the criticality of the resource, can define the BCDR needs of your resource. So it can be implemented in several stages, several ways as you like. And it's very powerful. You can benefit from it in several ways. As an example of an Azure Virtual Desktop environment, we tend to implement tags to set maintenance windows, to set auto-scaling tags, whether a host is an Azure Virtual Desktop host or not. We also implement those tags for alerting and monitoring. So on each and every resource that we deploy, we apply a tag, whether it's a critical resource and an important resource, whether it should be running 24/7, whether it's a low-cost resource that can be shut down without any issues. And that's where tags come into play. So let's have a look on how we can roll out tags, either by pushing them to your deployment scripts directly into your resources, or how Azure Policy can help you in applying tags on top of your Azure environment. Let's first go to our Visual Studio for some PowerShelling. There is some built-in commandlets that you can use to assign and build tags. So that's, for example, call the new AZ tag. Let's create a couple of new ones. New AZ tag name. We give it a name, species, value, Velociraptor, for example. New AZ tag, name, species, and then T-Rex. You can see I've used some other tags as well. So a BCDR tag to define which resources should be running 24/7, only 8.5, importance level like critical, or do not reanimate, a server that can easily be redeployed, for example. So let's just quickly deploy these tags. Now, if we look at the Azure portal and go to the tags section in the left side pane, we can see that already a couple of our tags have been deployed. If we refresh this one a little bit, then you will see that our tags are coming up. Now, what is very useful in this overview is that when you've already applied some tags to resources and you click on the tags in the portal, like let's say this one, you can easily see with a blinking of the eye which resources have been applied a certain tag. So in this case, I know that my production domain controller and my hub virtual network do need to require to be running 24/7. So in case of monitoring and alerting, I can read my tags which say BCDR 24/7 to provide me alerts when something goes down or is missing heartbeats and stuff like that. Same goes for importance. My production domain controller is pretty important, for example. So if something goes wrong with it, or there is a service that can't be started, I want an alert on that. So that's how you can easily navigate with tags. Now, a second way of deploying tags is doing this via Azure Policy, for example. So let's go back to our scripts. As stated earlier, with Azure Policy, you can do a lot of great things. Now, one of the things you can do as well is to use Azure Policy to deploy tags upon your environment. So the script is quite similar as we used earlier today. So we will be targeting our Jurassic root management group in our site A. And in this case, we will be using two separate RM templates, which are the tags. Again, the policy resource ID are hard to find of what it states. So first get started within the Azure portal to see what the Azure policy does, then copy the ID, provide your tags or parameters, and then deploy it via scripting. So in this case, we will be deploying a couple of tags or tags that should be inherited through other resources. Now, if we continue with our deployment, deploy the same thing on site B as well, and navigate to the Azure portal, go to Azure Policy, and then we can go to definitions. You will see that my tags policy has been deployed and that it should inherit a couple of tags. Now, in this case, it should inherit a certain tag name from my resource group, for example. So this is a policy that's been deployed. Now, the policy usually kicks in around 15 to 30 minutes, so my compliance level will still be 0, I assume, when I refresh here. So if I go to my policy, my tags policy, for example, it will state that it's still not compliant. So there are a couple of them which are compliant, but there are others which are not. And if I'm not mistaken, it will modify the tags to the resources. So what this will do, if you look at the resource groups, on our resource groups, we have a couple of tags, the environment tag and the customer tag, and those should be inherited in every resource that we have right below. So if we go to our networking tag, these tags should be applied to our virtual network as well. So as you can see, our policy already kicked in and applied our customer tag and environment hub tag, and this was one that was applied manually. So that's how easy it is to apply new tags with Azure Policy, of course. You can again apply tags manually. So if we go to our network security group, we can add a new tag, for example. If it's species, and it will be a velociraptor, for example. If we go to virtual machines and go to our web 01, we can also add a species here. So species T-Rex. And then normally within a couple of minutes, our Azure policies should be applying as well. And as you can see, it stated just a few seconds ago that there were no policies, and now it also inherited the customer and environment tag from my resource group. So when I go back to all of my tags and go to my environment tag hub, you can see all of the resources which did receive our tag that's being inherited through Azure Policy. So hope I was able to provide you an overview on how easy and useful tags can be. Thank you. Let's go to our next topic.
Managing a few resources through the Azure portal isn't really a big deal. However, over time, as you add more and more subscriptions and even more resources, it might become increasingly difficult to inventory Azure resources. The Azure Resource Graph is a useful service that indexes all of the information that your Azure resources contain across all of your subscriptions. On top of this, the Resource Graph provides you with a way to query your resources via the Kusto query language, or KQL for short. I'll show you how to get started in another demo. So let's go to the Azure Resource Graph Explorer by going to All Services and searching for the Graph Explorer. There it is. The search experience here on the top of the screen is actually powered by the Azure Resource Graph, so that's really cool. And as you can see, we get an editor that looks very similar to the one that is present in Log Analytics. So if you're familiar with that, you should feel right at home. If we want to start querying resources, we can do that. We can just simply type resources pipe count. That should give us a count of all of our resources, as you can see. So this is actually the KQL syntax that we're using here. We can also use the tree view here on the left to go into these virtual tables. You can also search in there. So let's just do that. Let me search for storage accounts. There we go. And we can actually really easily make some queries here if we just click on some things. So I want all of the resources, but I'm actually looking for everything that has the type Microsoft.storage/storage accounts. And let's see if we can't find all of the resources that do not support HTTPS only. So let's just change this a little. There we go. And now we should get 3 results. And as you can see, these results actually come from all of the different subscriptions. So with just one click, I'm able to query across all of those different subscriptions that my administrator has access to. And this actually also works in PowerShell. So if I open the Cloud Shell here, for instance, I've done this before just to speed up the demo a little, but I can perform the exact same query from within PowerShell. The benefit of doing this, the immediate benefit, is that if you're just fetching information, then this means that you don't have to switch subscriptions all the time in order to do something. So if I just format the results, you can see that we actually have the same results. And at this stage, you can just use this variable like you normally would in PowerShell. So it's actually an array of objects that you can manipulate. Really handy. Okay, so let's save this query. Just save it. We can save this query for ourselves, or we can share it with our colleagues if we wanted to. I'll just keep this one to myself for now. So storage accounts that do not support HTTPS only. Okay, save it. And if I wanted to open a different query, I could do that. So for instance, I could pick this one. So this one actually lists all of the different automation account runbooks by type. So you have PowerShell or Python runbooks that you can deploy. And here we can see an overview of how many of the different runbooks that we have. And if we wanted to, we could turn this into a chart. This isn't very useful, but you can imagine that when you have VMs, for instance, that you have a resource group with a ton of VMs in them, and you just want to be able to see at a glance how many of them are actually online. This can be very, very useful in that case. So if we pick the donut chart, for instance, then we can have this type of overview, and we can pin it to our dashboard if we wanted to. I'll just select pin here. And if I go to dashboards, I get the same result that I just had in the Graph Explorer. Nice. So one last thing that we could demo is that you can really do some more advanced stuff with the KQL. So for instance, we can get all of the automation accounts that have the env dev tag, or the resource groups, sorry, that have the env dev tag. And here you can see that we're actually performing some join statements here. We're also projecting away a couple of columns, let's say, that we don't need. So if we run this, then we should actually only get one result, and that is the automation account in the Dev West Europe Management Resource Group, because that resource group does have a tag attached to it, so we can actually see this. There we go. It has the environment dev tag, so that query worked. And so with those simple examples, I hope that you can kind of sort of see the possibilities that you have with the Azure Resource Graph. I think if the people over at Jurassic Park had Azure Active Directory Privileged Identity Management, they might have prevented the disastrous park-wide event from ever taking place. Well, maybe. In the movie, a disgruntled employee is able to execute a program that causes all of the park security systems to fail. Privileged identity management gives us the capability to provide time and approval-based role activation. We can require our users to provide a justification when they request for elevated permissions, and we can also require them to use things like multi-factor authentication. It gives us the opportunity to mitigate the risk of excessive or misuse of access permissions on resources that are absolutely critical to your organization. Perhaps equally important is the fact that privileged identity management provides you with notifications, access reviews, and audit logs all out of the box, so you don't need to build any of this yourself. So let's jump back into the portal and check this out. During our RBAC demo scenario, we introduced Kim, who is a support engineer and is part of the support level 1 Azure AD group. We have an RBAC rule in place that makes it so that the support group has been assigned the reader role at the subscription level. Kim also had the contributor role assigned to her so that she could modify the settings of one of our storage accounts. I'm going to have to remove that assignment now, but having someone manually assign roles as well as removing them after a user has made some changes is a tedious process. But fortunately, with privileged identity management, we can give our users the option to elevate their permissions whenever it is required. Before we get started, I'll remove the old contributor role assignment from the previous demo, and then I'll show you how privileged identity management works. So first, we will go to our resource groups, go into the storage resource group, go into our storage account, so logs 2, into the access control, role assignments, and here we can just remove Kim from that assignment. There we go, so that's done. And now we can go into privileged identity management. So I'll just open this up, and under manage, we can go to the Azure resources. And here you'll be presented with all the available resources that you can apply privileged identity management magic to. You can select the management groups or the subscriptions or resource groups or individual resources. I will just select the resource group for now. So we want the storage resource group. And here you're presented with a dashboard, so you can keep an eye on things here if you wanted to. But we're interested in the roles. And here you will get a list of all of the roles that are available to you in Azure, as well as all of your custom roles. Those will be listed here as well. And I'm looking for the storage account contributor role. So this one. And as you can see, we don't have any eligible or active or expired assignments. I'll actually edit the settings for this one. And modifying the settings for the storage account contributor role actually makes it so that these settings only apply to this scope. So only the settings that we're about to see are only going to apply to this Dev West Europe storage resource group. So if you have a different resource here in the in this overview of all of your resources, if you were to select this one, you could actually apply totally different settings as opposed to this one. So that is very cool, and just shows you how flexible privileged identity management is. But let's go back to setting up this role assignment here. So again, I'll search for storage account contributor, and I'll modify the settings this time. So we have a lot of different settings that we can tinker with. Let's just click edit. Okay, and here we have all of the available settings. I can set a maximum duration, so how long can a user use this assignment. We're going to set it to, let's say, 2 hours. 2 hours is fine. If we wanted to, we can require the user to use multi-factor authentication again. So they have to go through the multi-factor authentication process. Also really useful for logging purposes is that the user has to enter a justification, a reason as to why they want to activate this role. So that's really helpful. You can also make it so that this role requires someone else to actually approve of the request before it is activated. So you can pick a user here or a group. It's totally up to you, but I will leave this disabled for now. Then we can head on over to the assignments tab. So assignments can be either an eligible assignment or an active assignment. An active assignment is just something that is always active, and an eligible assignment is something that you have to request access to. You can make it so that you can always request access to it so that it doesn't expire, but if you have processes in your company that requires you to, check whether or not a specific group should still have certain types of privileges within your Azure environment, you can make it so that you are notified after a year or after 6 months, 3 months, 1 month, or 15 days that you have to, reevaluate whether or not these users are allowed to request this type of access. But we will leave this like it is for now. And if you want, you can also enter a couple of email addresses here so that you are notified whenever someone requests to be added to this role. This storage account contributor role on this resource group, so on the Development West Europe Storage resource group. So let's just try this out. To open this in a container. Okay, so portal.azure.com. There we go. So we're logged in as Kim now. And let's take a look at some things first, right? We want to see if everything has been cleaned up. So the role assignments should be gone. So the contributor role assignment should be gone. But we actually did not assign it to the storage resource group. We actually assigned it to an individual resource. So let's take a look. still gone. Okay, that's good. So if we try to make changes to the configuration of this storage account, we will not be able to do that. So what we need to do now is we need to request access to that specific role. And in order to do that, we have to open up Privileged Identity Management as Kim. We can go into My Roles. And then obviously it says no results because we're in the Azure AD roles. We want to look at the Azure resources. And here you can see that we have an eligible assignment here. So for the resource group that we specified, and we can request activation. So there we go. It's picked up that we can have a maximum duration of 2 hours. So that's great. That's what we entered in our settings page. This all looks okay to me. I'd like to change a few things, please. Okay, and then if we wanted to, we could change the scope to a specific resource if we wanted to, but we'll just leave it on the default for now. And we'll just hit activate. And then we will be redirected, or the browser will automatically refresh, and we will be in our storage account contributor role for 2 hours. So let's wait and see. Okay, so I had to manually refresh the page, but that's okay. Let's take a look at the active assignments. And it says that it should be okay. So we have our storage account contributor assignment scoped to our specific resource group. So we can go ahead and check that out. Go into the resource groups, storage resource group, and we should be able to see it right here. Let's take a look. Storage account contributor, Kim. That is good. That's what we want. So this means that I should be able to modify logs 1 or logs and logs 2. Let's take another peek here. It should be the same because it's inherited from the resource group, right? And if I wanted to change some of these settings, it's fine. Boom, there we go. That worked. Will it work for the second or the first storage account rather? I think so. There we go. Excellent. This also should have generated a few entries in the logs. So let's take a look. If I go into my audit history, Azure resources, then I should be able to see that I requested to be in the storage account contributor role and that I made it just because I wanted to make a few changes. So that's good. And I should also see the exact same audit details in my administrator's view. So if I switch back and go back to the overview, yes, that looks all right. So let's click that. And here we can see that Kim asked to be in the storage account contributor role and that it was approved. So that's looking good. And it has the exact same reason, so looks good. And that is privileged identity management in a nutshell. As an Azure administrator, you can choose to lock a subscription, resource group, or resource to prevent your other users in your organization from accidentally deleting or modifying resources. Locks are a small feature that can still be quite useful, as it can override any permissions that a security principal might have. So let's go back into the portal and check this out. All right, so here we are, and now we'll go into our test storage resource group. And in here, we will select the locks option. You can always search for it if you can't quite see it. We'll just select it here. And then we'll hit add, and then we can select a lock type. And now, as you can see, there are two different types of locks. So the delete lock means that authorized users can still read and modify resources, but they can't delete the resource. And with the read-only lock, that means that authorized users can read a resource, but they can't delete it or update the resource. So no modifying allowed. Applying this lock is kind of similar to when you would use the reader role on all of the users. But unlike role-based access control, you use management locks to apply restrictions across all the users and any of the roles that they might have. So that's important to point out here. We will set a delete lock, so that will still allow us to perform modifications. So we'll just call it do not delete. Hit OK. And what this is going to do is the lock has been applied to our resource group and all the resources beneath it. So if we were to do this on a subscription level, for instance, this would be the same thing. So for every resource group in that subscription, the delete lock would have been applied. And you could take that one step further and go into the management groups, and then it will get applied to all the subscriptions and those subscriptions, resource groups, and resources. So that's how it works in a parent-child relationship. We can see this in action if we go into the storage account, and I'll just search for locks, and then you'll see that the lock has been inherited here. If we jump back to the resource group and we try to delete it, you'll see that that won't work. Again, this overrides all of the users, their role assignments, so it doesn't matter who tries to perform this action. If we can even demonstrate this through the Cloud Shell. If we go into the Cloud Shell and wait a bit, if we select subscription first, the subscription test West Europe subscription, go. And as you can see, we're actually logged in with a managed service account here for the Cloud Shell. So if we were to get our resource group, source group, see, we can only see the storage resource group here. And if we were to delete it, remove easy resource group, that should not work. So hit yes, there you go. So that is working beautifully. Same thing with the storage account, can't be deleted. If we were to try this in the shell, we would get the same results. Name. If we try to remove them, yes, that will not work either. So that's working fine. Excellent. But still, we can change the settings in here, and same goes for the resource group if we were to change some of the settings in there. So we can actually do this. If we select the configuration, maybe disable the secure transfer, we can still update that. That's great. So an important thing to note here is that locks don't necessarily apply to all types of operations. So Azure operations are typically divided into two categories. So we have the data plane operations and the control plane operations. And locks only apply to the control plane operations. So that means that operations which are sent to the management.azure.com domain will be blocked in this case, but data plane operations will not be blocked. So anything that is sent to, for instance, myaccount.blob.core.windows.net will not be blocked. So if you were to use the REST API, for instance, for modifying blobs, then you will still be able to do that. Nothing will stop you from doing that. So that is an important thing to keep in mind. We can actually demonstrate this. So I already have a test container in here, so I will just open that. And remember, we have a delete lock on here. So if I were to upload my test file, you can see I've already tested this a few times. If we were to upload it, there we go, that just works. And we can now actually delete this file. Yes, so there's nothing stopping us from doing this. And this is because of the following. I will demonstrate this. We can actually use the network tab here. I like to use this every now and again to see how everything works under the hood. If we upload this, it actually gets sent to the name of my storage account .blob.core.windows.net. So that is why we can also delete the blob here, because it isn't being subject to the resource locks. There we go. Now, if we jump back, and let's just clear this. If I were to delete this container, because I'm doing it through the portal, and because the portal is configured in such a way that it goes through the management domain, it will not work because the operation is being sent to management.azure.com. So that is how locks work. We can also, again, apply a read-only lock if we wanted to. I can apply one here, actually. Do that. So only read-only, only apply it to this storage account. And if I were to change some of the settings now, that will not work. So I can try to save it, but it will actually fail. So that seems to work just fine. If you want to learn more about all these different operations, so the difference between the control plane and the data plane operations, there's actually a very useful documentations page on the Azure Docs, where you can learn all about the difference between these various operations. This is very useful if you want to just be sure that when you're going to apply locks, that it doesn't mess up anything else that you don't want it to mess up, of course.
Thank you, Thomas, for those awesome demos. Let's have a look at our next tip, which is do not expose your legacy assets directly to the world. In a lot of cloud migrations, we've seen that migrating to Azure as soon as possible is the preferred way of migrating to Azure without overthinking optimizations or security. Now, in the case of a traditional web server, an IIS farm, for example, a lot of customers just tend to add a public IP to that IIS virtual machine. Now, they often forget that that can be an attack vector, of course, because a lot of attack simulations just go scan all of the open IIS ports, 443, port 80 in some cases. Now, there is a cool thing built into Azure Active Directory, which is often forgotten, unfortunately, which is Azure AD Application Proxy. And Azure AD Application Proxy can really help provide an additional layer of security without adding additional code to your website or adding complexity to your website. It's just enabling Azure AD Application Proxy, installing the Azure AD Application Proxy agent, and then providing Azure AD authentication to your legacy IIS farm. So let's have a look how we can expose our internal website in 5 minutes to the outside world by enabling Azure AD Application Proxy and enforcing multi-factor authentication. Azure AD Application Proxy is a component built into Azure Active Directory. So if you, like you can see in the left side pane, when you scroll down a little bit, you have Application Proxy. Now, when you start off with a new and brand new Azure AD tenant, you will not see any connectors. I've did some testing and did some proof of concepts with Application Proxy, so that's what you're seeing here. Now what we can do is create a new connector group. So T-Rex connector group, for example. Let's create it. Let's not assign a connector yet. And what we then can do is download the connector server. What it will do is just download an executable file that can be installed on your domain controller, for example. So let's just wait for our downloads to complete. Here we go. Now let's log on to our domain controller, which is located in our Azure subscription. Now, please note that this can also be done on your on-premises environment, so it doesn't need to be an environment that's running in Azure, of course. So let's RDP to our domain controller. Here we go. Here we are. Now, on this environment, we have an IIS server running as well, which is only available on the internal network. So if you look on my DNS settings, I do have a website running called Jurassic governance.uncom.be, which redirects to this website. So there's no authentication whatsoever. Just a basic plain vanilla IIS website running. So the same server is also running on my Azure environment, which does not have a public IP. So it's only available throughout my internal network. Now, let's get started by installing our web connector on it. So let's just create a directory called ctemp or something you like, and upload the application proxy connector to it. That's the wrong copy. There we go. Wait for it to be copied. Now, just to show you that it is indeed only available from the internal network. No external access to this web server. Okay, so we have our proxy installed. Let's run this, and then we will need to authenticate, of course. Okay, we log on with a global administrator account to our Azure AD tenant. Go. Then it will auto register within our Azure AD tenant, and then the only thing we will need to do, if you're running behind the proxy, of course, then be sure to check out the configure outbound proxy settings, because that will require some ports to be opened. So this has been installed. If we go back to Azure Active Directory to our application proxy, we will see that we have a new server, which is our prddc.uncom.pe, and let's just add it to our connector group, our T-Rex connector. So now we have a connection between our Azure AD application proxy and our on-premises environment or traditional domain controller environment with our server park. What we now can do is configure an app. And how can we do that? Just click on configure an app, give it a name, T-Rex app, for example, and my internal URL would be Jurassic governance.uncom.be. So we can't use any wildcards, so we need HTTP like that. It's not a valid external host name, so let's just give it this one, for example. Okay, pre-authentication. You can either use pass-through, which will then use pass-through authentication from Azure AD. So it will first primarily authenticate to Azure AD and then to your on-premises ID. In this case, we will just be using Azure AD because we haven't set up any hybrid identity. Then we select the connector group, in this case, the T-Rex connector group. Depending on the type of app you will be running behind this application proxy, you will need to add or change some of these settings, of course. Now, in this case, for our demo, we will just use the default settings. Now we can click Add. Now here you can see the external URL that we can use to access our app as soon as it has been created in Azure AD application proxy. Of course, this isn't an URL that you can remember, so it's best to just try to add a, oh, something failed with my proxy. Not sure what. Let's try to make the URL a little bit more friendly, like this. Like that. Probably the URL length that wasn't correct. So this is my new URL. Now it won't be accessible yet because what it did register a new application, T-Rex, in my enterprise apps, and we need to assign a user, of course, so that it can be used by one of them. So currently there's no one able to access it. So if we would browse to this one and try to log on, it will give an access denied. Now, what we need to do is you need to assign a user or a group to this app. And this way you can trim down the number of users or roles that you want to assign to this application. So there's, within enterprise apps, there's a lot of extra things that you can configure. In the application proxy, you can still make changes to your app if you want. And here you can then copy your URL. So let's try to browse back. It usually takes a little bit more time. And here we go. We have our website available for us through our Azure AD application proxy. So if I go to t-rex.uncom.com, it redirects me. And when I go directly to the MS app proxy URL, it will redirect me as well. So now I'm working on my internal server with Azure AD application proxy and Azure AD authentication. Oh yeah, and our last tip of the day, life will always find its way, as do Azure resources. If you take our key takeaways into account and apply the governance tools that we highlighted during this session, you're already one step ahead.
With that said, I hope you found this interesting. If you want to learn some more about some of the topics that we've discussed here today, you can find us over at LinkedIn, Twitter, or GitHub. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks everyone for watching. Hope you've enjoyed our session.